Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Vladimir Petrov, 78, still proudly bore the marks of his years of service. Each medal on his chest told a story of courage, sacrifice, and battles fought for his country. Decorated for his missions behind enemy lines during World War II, he was respected by all who knew his past. That morning, the sun gently lit the paths of Moscow's Central Park. The birds sang, and the light wind made the leaves dance on the trees. Vladimir walked slowly, leaning on his carved cane, his gaze proud but attentive with every step. He was going to a memorial gathering to meet his brothers in arms, looking forward to sharing a few moments with those who had gone through the same ordeal. But the world had changed. Young people no longer knew the value of discipline or the respect due to their elders. Without warning, an impatient young man shoved Vladimir, knocking some of his medals to the ground. Passers-by froze in shock. The veteran straightened, his gaze calm but filled with deep indignation. Within seconds, a heavy silence fell around him. No one dared to intervene. Yet, in that silence, the voice of duty and honor whispered, "Today, respect would be felt," and in less than 4 minutes, the story would take an unexpected turn. Vladimir moved slowly, his steps measured and his gaze fixed straight ahead. Every movement was imbued with dignity, a living testament to his years of service. His medals glittered in the sunlight, like fragments of his country's history. Suddenly, a young man in a hurry appeared, violently shoving Vladimir without a word of apology. The veteran stumbled, and several of his medals fell to the ground, clanging against the park's pavement. Passers-by watched in dismay. Some murmured, others remained motionless, unsure of how to intervene. The young man sneered, convinced that no consequences awaited him. "Old man, you should stay home," he snapped, with a mixture of contempt and arrogance. Vladimir slowly straightened up, carefully gathering his decorations. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from suppressed anger. He took a deep breath and whispered to himself. "Some people no longer know what respect means." Without wasting a moment, he took out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. His voice, though weak with age, was firm and determined. "Sergey, they dared. They dared to treat me like this. Stay where you are, I need you." On the other end of the line, Sergey, his former war comrade, immediately understood the gravity of the situation. "Stay calm, Vladimir. We're coming." Less than 4 minutes later, the park that had just been the scene of this humiliation would experience an unexpected turn of events. The story of an offended veteran would transform into a demonstration of strength, solidarity, and respect that no one would forget. Less than 4 minutes had passed since Vladimir's humiliation, but each second was enough to create a palpable tension in the park. Passers-by watched, some excited, others intrigued, but none dared to intervene. Then, in the distance, a figure appeared, Sergey, a veteran like Vladimir, walking confidently despite his 80 years. Behind him, several other men and women, all veterans, were weaving through the trees and paths, proudly wearing their medals, like a silent army of respect and honor. As they approached, the arrogant young man felt a shiver of unease run down his spine. He was now surrounded by an imposing presence, a quiet force that demanded only one thing: respect. Sergey came to Vladimir's side and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You are safe now, my friend," he said, his voice deep and comforting. The other veterans surrounded Vladimir, forming a protective circle. Each of them exuded authority and discipline, qualities undiminished by time. The young man, panicked, instinctively backed away, almost tripping on the cobblestones of the park. Sergey walked towards him, his gaze piercing. "You just disrespected more than just an old man. You just disrespected history, our sacrifices, and everything we gave so that young people like you could walk free in this park." Silence fell around them. Passers-by held their breath. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if listening to the lesson the veterans were about to deliver. The young man stammered an apology, but Sergey shook his head disapprovingly. "It's not fear you need to feel. It's respect you need to learn. In those few minutes, the initial humiliation had already begun to transform into a public lesson in dignity, and the park became the scene of a moment that no one would soon forget. The young man, still frozen in front of Vladimir and his brothers in arms, began to feel a real panic. He had thought his arrogance would go unnoticed, but the imposing presence of the veterans, each proudly wearing their decorations, completely changed everything. Sergei took another step forward, his gaze fixed on the young man with an intensity that was almost palpable. "Listen to me," he said, his voice firm and implacable. "What you just did wasn't just rude. It was an affront to men who risked their lives for this country, so that young people like you could live in safety. You have no idea what the word sacrifice means." The veterans around Vladimir remained silent, but their posture and presence were enough to convey colossal strength. The young man, trembling, stammered a few words, trying to justify himself. I didn't want to. I didn't know." But Sergei shook his head. "You know exactly what you're doing. You're disrespecting your elders, your history, and your country. And it won't go unpunished." Vladimir, standing with dignity in the center of the circle, spoke calmly, his voice low but sharp. "I don't mean to harm you. But you must understand that every action has its consequences. It is not through force that we teach respect, but through truth and justice." The young man lowered his head, unable to meet their gaze. The passers-by, silent until then, began to film the scene with their phones, aware that they were witnessing an exceptional moment. The veteran's initial humiliation was about to turn into a true moral and social wake-up call. Sergei took a step forward, indicating that the moment of truth had arrived. "You're going to apologize now. And let your words be sincere. Not to escape shame, but to show that you understand." The young man, his hands trembling and his face red with shame, prepared to speak. But what he was about to say would seal his lesson and leave a lasting impression on all who witnessed this scene. The young man trembled, his eyes lowered, while Sergei and the other veterans stared at him with an almost solemn intensity. Vladimir, still in the center, watched the scene calmly, letting the tension build around him. After a long silence, the young man finally stammered. I'm sorry, so sorry." Sergei raised an eyebrow, the silence fell again, heavy. "That's not enough," he said, his voice deep. "The words must come from the heart, and you must understand why you're apologizing." The young man, flushed with shame, finally looked up at Vladimir. He saw the elderly, decorated man, motionless but upright, like a living symbol of dignity. The weight of this veteran's story, his sacrifices and his courage, was felt. The crowd around him held its breath. I should never have pushed you, or disrespected your age or your medals. I understand that I was unfair and disrespectful, and I deeply regret what I did," he whispered, his voice shaky but sincere. Vladimir stepped forward and placed a firm hand on the young man's shoulder. "It's not just a matter of politeness," he said calmly but authoritatively. "It's a matter of respect, memory, and honor. Each generation must learn to respect the one that came before it. Never forget that." The crowd applauded softly, some with tears in their eyes. The veterans surrounding Vladimir nodded approvingly, while the young man looked down, knowing that this lesson would remain etched in his memory. In just a few minutes, an act of arrogance had been transformed into a moment of justice and universal respect. The veteran's dignity, far from being damaged, had reminded everyone that honor is not measured by physical strength, but by rectitude and moral courage. The scene in the park captured the attention of passers-by. What had begun as an act of humiliation had transformed into a moment of dignity and justice. Cell phones were out, and soon, several videos showing Vladimir surrounded by his brothers in arms were circulating on social media, arousing admiration and emotion. Some passers-by stepped forward to help Vladimir properly replace his fallen medals. A young woman, moved, held out a handkerchief to wipe the dust off one of them. An older man, also a retired military man, gave the veteran a respectful salute. Each gesture seemed to reaffirm that society could still recognize and honor courage and experience. Vladimir watched all this with a slight smile. He had never sought fame or recognition. But seeing this solidarity, this spontaneous respect from strangers, strengthened his faith in humanity and the transmission of values. The young man, still on his knees, felt the weight of the situation. He understood that the humiliation he had inflicted was not only personal, it had been an affront to history, to collective memory, and to all those who had sacrificed their youth for a better future. Sergei put a hand on Vladimir's shoulder and said, "Today you reminded us all why we must continue to stand, even after all these years. You reminded us that honor is passed on, that it never disappears." Vladimir nodded, his heart filled with gratitude. We must never forget that respect is earned and maintained, not through fear, but through dignity and unity. The crowd, moved, applauded again. The park, which had been the scene of an act of contempt, had become a living symbol of solidarity, intergenerational respect, and moral lesson. Vladimir, surrounded by his brothers in arms, knew that this day would remain etched in the memory of all who had witnessed this scene. The park was beginning to calm down, but the echoes of the incident still resonated in the minds of all who witnessed it. Vladimir, surrounded by his brothers in arms, stood erect, his medals back in place. He sensed a particular energy in the air, a mixture of respect, gratitude, and collective emotion. As the passers-by gradually moved away, some stopped to exchange a few words with him. A shy young man approached and asked, "Mr. Petrov, can you tell us what these medals mean?" Vladimir smiled softly, his gaze distant. "Each one tells a story of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood. But it's not just my life that you see here. It's the life of all those who fought, who gave, sometimes even their lives, so that you can walk freely in this park today." A respectful silence fell. The young people listened attentively, and for some, it was the first time they fully understood the meaning of the word sacrifice. Sergei, next to him, added, "What we are doing today is not just for ourselves. It is to convey a message, that respect, dignity and honor never disappear, even with time." Vladimir nodded. He knew the story didn't end with this park. The videos would circulate, reaching other cities, other generations. And perhaps through this simple incident, a young man would learn to respect those who came before him, and to honor those whose actions had built a better future. As he and his companions walked slowly away, the wind lightly lifted his gray hair. His gaze met that of the humiliated young man, who this time stood, scarred but transformed by the lesson. Vladimir knew that, in a way, a small legacy had been passed on, the quiet strength of experience and the immutable weight of honor. Just hours after the incident in the park, videos shot by passers-by had gone viral on social media. The story of Vladimir and his comrades in arms sparked a wave of emotion across Moscow and beyond. Comments praised their dignity, courage, and the lesson in respect they had taught the arrogant young man. Journalists began arriving at the park to meet Vladimir and his comrades. They wanted to understand what had really happened and tell the story of a veteran who was humiliated but quickly defended by his brothers in arms. The local press published articles headlined, "A decorated veteran reminds younger generations of their respect," and "A veteran's honor in the face of arrogance." Vladimir, sitting on a bench with Sergei at his side, watched the cameras and microphones, but remained humble. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," he said calmly. "What you see today is simply solidarity and respect among those who have gone through the same ordeals." The veterans present were also interviewed. Each of them explained that it was not a question of revenge, but of transmitting values. Their unity and moral strength had transformed a personal humiliation into a public example of honor and dignity. Social media quickly amplified the message, hundreds of thousands of views, shares, and admiring comments. Young people, touched by the lesson, began to reflect on how they treated their elders and the importance of intergenerational respect. Even the young man who had pushed Vladimir was contacted by journalists. He publicly acknowledged his mistake and offered a sincere apology, knowing that this day would remain etched in his memory and that of all witnesses. Thus, in just a few hours, an event that could have remained anonymous became a symbol of moral justice and solidarity, reminding everyone that true power lies not in arrogance, but in dignity, unity, and respect for the values transmitted by those who sacrificed their youth for the common good. In the days following the incident, the story of Vladimir and his brothers-in-arms continued to circulate in Moscow and local schools. Teachers and educators decided to show the videos to students to illustrate the importance of respect, honor, and solidarity. At a school in the city center, a teacher placed the video on a large screen in front of a silent class. The students, captivated, watched Vladimir standing in the park, surrounded by his classmates, imposing by his presence and dignity. The teacher explained, "Look carefully. This isn't just the story of a veteran or a young man who was disrespected. It's a lesson about responsibility, about understanding and honoring those who paved the way before us." The reactions were immediate. Some students exchanged glances, reflecting on their own behavior. Others stood up and discussed passionately, sharing their personal experiences of respect and solidarity with their elders. The humiliated young man became a role model in his own right. He was invited to speak to young people at a community center, explaining how a mistake could be turned into a lesson through humility and sincerity. "I realized that arrogance and disrespect lead nowhere," he confessed. "What I experienced taught me to listen, observe, and honor those who came before me." Vladimir, informed of these initiatives, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His action had not only restored his honor, it had sown seeds of conscience and respect in a new generation. The veterans' solidarity and example had resonated with young hearts, proving that courage and dignity transcend time and generations. Thus, what began as a humiliation in the middle of the park turned into a true moral and social lesson, strengthening the link between the past and the present, and ensuring that the legacy of respect and honor would endure. The story of Vladimir and his brothers-in-arms wasn't confined to social media or schools. It quickly spread throughout the neighborhood and beyond, reaching the local community as a whole. Residents began to speak of the day as a historic moment, where honor and respect triumphed over arrogance and disrespect. In cafes, shops, and even on public transport, people discussed the event. Some spoke of Vladimir's moral strength, others of the veterans' exemplary solidarity. All agreed on one point: it was not just a veteran who had been defended, but the very idea that dignity should be protected and respected. Local veterans associations organized meetings and discussions, using the incident as an example to raise awareness among young people and remind everyone of the importance of civic-mindedness and respect for their elders. Local media published reports on intergenerational solidarity, while public figures praised the veterans' actions. Even the young man who had pushed Vladimir was invited to participate in these initiatives. Transformed by the lesson he learned, he took part in workshops on respect and citizenship, sharing his experience and sincere repentance. His presence became a symbol that even mistakes could become a driving force for positive change. Vladimir, ever humble, looked at all this with a mixture of pride and serenity. He knew that his actions, combined with those of his brothers-in-arms, had triggered a chain reaction in society. The entire city had been reminded of the fundamental values of solidarity, respect, and dignity, and these lessons would last long after this day. The park where it all began became a symbolic place of remembrance. Residents came to stroll there, often in silence, reminding themselves that honor and dignity, even in the face of humiliation, could inspire an entire neighborhood and transform society. As weeks passed, Vladimir's story continued to resonate throughout the city. The park where the incident took place became a living symbol of dignity and solidarity. Passers-by told younger children what they had seen and experienced, and schools used the event as a valuable moral lesson about respect and honor. Vladimir, surrounded by his brothers-in-arms, still strolled through the park, his shining medals reflecting the sun, but more than ever, it was his presence and attitude that inspired others. Young people came to ask him questions, curious to know the story behind each decoration. He answered with patience and humility, sharing not only war stories, but also the values that had guided his life: courage, respect, loyalty, and solidarity. The young man who had pushed him around became a beacon of redemption. Transformed by the experience, he actively participated in community programs, sharing his story and encouraging others to learn from their mistakes. He was no longer just the man who had humiliated a veteran, he had become a beacon of conscience and respect for his generation. The city, moved by this display of dignity and solidarity, held a symbolic ceremony in tribute to the veterans. Vladimir and his comrades were honored not only for their past exploits, but also for reminding everyone that true strength lies in respect and unity. Vladimir, standing at the center of the ceremony, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He knew that his action that day, simple as it may have seemed, had sown seeds of respect and honor that would flourish long after he was gone. His legacy was not just one of medals, but of lessons taught, of young people aware of their actions, and of a community united by the values he had embodied throughout his life. And so, the initial humiliation, which could have been a simple anecdote, became a lasting symbol, that of a decorated veteran whose dignity and courage had inspired an entire city, reminding everyone that respect and honor cannot be bought, they must be lived and passed on.